The heat didn't begin in the ovens. It started in the marrow of Alara Vance's bones, a sudden, subterranean friction that sparked and roared upward until her skin felt like it was being knit from pure solar flares. It was the change, the dreaded, magnificent, chaotic change, and today it had decided to manifest as an aggressive yeast rebellion. "Down!" Alara hissed, pressing her palm against the cool rim of a mason jar. Inside, the sourdough starter, usually a docile, bubbling beige pet named Herman, was currently frothing with the enthusiasm of a rabid beast. The lid rattled ominously. Pop! A second jar, Herman Jr., blew its lid across the prep table, sending a spray of fermented flour onto the floorboards of the moonlit crumb. Alara groaned, wiping a sheen of perspiration from her forehead with the back of her wrist. Her auburn curls, already escaping their pins in a wild halo, stuck to her temples. She could smell her own magic spiking. It had the distinct, crackling scent of ozone and burnt sugar, overlaying the shop's usual comforting perfume of dried lavender and scorched butter. "I am 46 years old," she muttered to the empty kitchen, grabbing a damp cloth. "I am a terrifyingly competent hedge witch. I should not be bullied by a bacterial culture." The air in the bakery shimmered. A copper whisk, sensing her agitation, lifted itself gently off the counter and began to hover at eye level, spinning lazily. Alara glared at it. The telekinesis was new, a symptom of her hormones deciding to rewrite her magical signature without her permission. "Don't you dare," she warned the whisk. Before the utensil could decide whether to obey or sauce her with ganache, the bell above the front door chimed. It wasn't the cheerful ding-a-ling that heralded Mrs. Higgins coming for her morning scone. This was a decisive, singular toll. A judgment. Alara froze. Through the swinging porthole window of the kitchen door, she saw him, Silas Thorne. He stood on the welcome mat like a darker shadow cast by the afternoon sun. Even from here, the man radiated an aura of rigid, uncompromising geometry. He was 50, though he wore his age like he wore his charcoal suit, with immaculate, expensive precision. His hair was a thick shock of iron and silver, swept back from a face that seemed carved from granite and stubbornness. Panic, cold and sharp, doused her hot flash. The health inspector. "Not today," she whispered, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Please, goddess, not today." She turned to the hovering whisk, snatched it out of the air, and shoved it unceremoniously into a drawer. She smoothed her apron over her hips, soft curves that had grown more generous in the last year, and took a breath that tasted of rosemary and fear. Pushing through the swinging door, she forced a smile that felt too tight on her face. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice dropping to that husky register she couldn't quite control. "To what do I owe the pleasure? Or is pleasure too strong a word for a surprise audit?" Silas Thorne didn't smile. He adjusted his wire-rimmed spectacles, his eyes the color of slate under a winter sky, and scanned the front of the shop. He looked at the display case of blackberry galettes. He looked at the hand-painted menu board. He looked at a spider plant hanging in the corner as if he suspected it of harboring fugitive fruit flies. Finally, his gaze landed on her. For a second, the air between them grew heavy, charged with something that wasn't magic and certainly wasn't municipal code. He looked at her the way a wolf might look at a particularly confusing trap, wary but interested. "Ms. Vance," Silas said. His voice was a deep baritone, smooth as polished oak. "We received a complaint about ventilation. I'm here to ensure the moonlit crumb isn't violating Code 14B regarding airborne particulate matter." Alara crossed her arms, trying to hide the fact that her hands were trembling. "Particulate matter? You mean flour in a bakery? Scandalous, Silas, truly." He stepped closer. He smelled incredible. Crisp starch, rain on pavement, and something darker, like ink or black tea. It was a scent so aggressively human and grounded that it made her own volatile magic itch beneath her skin. "Regulations are not suggestions, Alara," he said softly, using her first name. He only did that when he was about to be difficult, or when he was looking at her mouth, which he was doing right now. "If your ventilation is failing, you're a fire hazard. And considering your eclectic approach to kitchen safety, I felt a personal inspection was warranted." "My kitchen is safe," she lied. Behind her in the back room, she heard the distinct thwump of a sourdough jar finally exploding. Silas tilted his head, his eyes narrowing behind the glass lenses. "What was that?" "My knee," Alara said quickly. "Joints. You know how it is. We aren't getting any younger." My knees do not sound like a muffled detonation, Ms. Vance. He pulled a clipboard from his briefcase, the leather snapping audibly. Kitchen. Now. He moved past her, and the brush of his tailored sleeve against her bare arm sent a jolt through her that had nothing to do with menopause. It was a static shock of awareness, a reminder that beneath the skepticism and the rulebook, Silas Thorne was a man who ran deep waters. Alara scrambled to follow him, her mind racing. If he saw the doe climbing the walls, he'd shut her down. If he saw a broom sweeping by itself, he'd have her committed. Silas, wait, she said, reaching for his arm. He stopped at the kitchen door, his hand on the brass plate, and looked back at her. The skepticism in his eyes softened, just a fraction. Alara, you look flushed. Are you unwell? The concern was genuine, and it disarmed her more than his authority. It's just warm in here, the ovens. Then the ventilation is broken. He pushed the door open. Alara braced herself for disaster. The kitchen was a mess of flour and sticky dough, but thankfully nothing was currently levitating. Herman the sourdough starter was oozing across the counter like a sentient slime mold. But to the untrained eye, it just looked like a baking accident. Silas stepped in, his polished Oxfords crunching on a dusting of sugar. He surveyed the chaos with a slow, agonizing shake of his head. He pulled a pen from his pocket, a silver fountain pen that caught the light, and made a note on his clipboard. Uncontained biological agents, he murmured. It's yeast, Silas. It's practically a pet. It's on the floor, Alara. He turned to face her, the small space forcing them into an intimacy neither had asked for. The heat in the kitchen was stifling, heavy with the scent of rising dough and the sharp, metallic tang of Alara's anxiety. I was getting to it, she said, backing up until her hips hit the butcher block island. Silas stepped forward, trapping her, not aggressively but inevitably. He placed one hand on the counter beside her waist, leaning in to inspect a copper pot hanging on the rack above her head. Dust on the cookware, he noted, his voice vibrating in her chest. He was close, too close. She could see the fine lines fanning out from his eyes, the heavy shadow of stubble beneath the skin of his jaw. The man was a masterpiece of masculine architecture, and it was infuriating. You enjoy this, she breathed, looking up at him, her eyes the color of crushed sage locked with his slate ones. You enjoy tormenting me. Silas paused. His gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes. The air between them thickened, snapping with a tension that felt like a rubber band stretched to its breaking point. I enjoy order, Alara, he said, his voice dropping an octave. And you are the most disorderly thing in this city. Boom. It wasn't ajar this time. The sound came from the front of the shop, a sudden rushing impact against the front door, as if a gale-force wind had slammed into the wood. The lights in the kitchen flickered. The temperature plummeted 20 degrees in a heartbeat, turning Alara's sweat to ice. Silas straightened instantly, the predator replacing the bureaucrat. What the hell was that? Alara didn't answer. She couldn't. The air was suddenly thick with a new scent, one that made the hair on her arms stand up. It wasn't yeast or lavender. It was the smell of a thunderstorm before the rain falls. Pure, crackling power. And something else. Milk and ancient violets. Stay here, she ordered, her voice ringing with a command that surprised them both. She pushed past him, rushing into the front of the shop. The front door had blown open, the bell jangling violently against the glass. Outside, the street was sunny and calm, oblivious to the sudden gust that had assaulted her bakery. But on the doormat, where Silas had stood moments ago, sat a basket. It was woven from dark, twisted willow, lined with silk the color of midnight. Alara fell to her knees, her heart lodging in her throat. She reached out, her fingers trembling as she pulled back the heavy velvet blanket. A baby. Not just a baby. A child of the high kin. The infant stared up at her with eyes that were not blue or brown, but a startling, luminous violet. The baby didn't cry. It watched her with an ancient, terrifying intelligence, tiny hands gripping the edge of the blanket. As Alara leaned closer, a spark of silver light jumped from the baby's fingertip to her nose, stinging like static. Hide me, the magic seemed to whisper directly into her blood. Alara gasped, the protective instinct hitting her harder than the hot flash had. It was a physical blow, a desperate, feral need to shield this creature from everything. The world, the sun, the health inspector. Ms. Vance? Silas's footsteps clicked on the hardwood behind her. Why is the door open? I felt a draft that violates at least 3 heating efficiency statutes. Panic clawed at her throat. She couldn't let him see. He was a man of logic, of forms and boxes. He wouldn't see a baby. He would see a social services case. He would see an abandoned child in a food preparation zone. He would call the police, and the police would put this child into the system. And the magical signature radiating off this infant would attract things far worse than bureaucrats. Alara grabbed the basket, scrambling to her feet just as Silas rounded the counter. She shoved the basket behind her back, her wide skirts doing little to hide the bulk. She leaned back against the display case, knocking a scone onto the floor. "Just a delivery," she squeaked. Her voice was an octave too high. "Flower, special, high-velocity flower delivery." Silas stopped dead. He looked at the open door. He looked at the scone on the floor. And then he looked at her, his eyes narrowing with laser-like focus. "You're shaking," he observed. He stepped closer, encroaching on her space again. And I heard a noise. A cry. The baby chose that exact moment to let out a coo. It wasn't a normal baby sound. It sounded like a wind chime made of crystal. Silas went still. His gaze drifted from her face to the space behind her back. His expression shifted from annoyance to a cold, hard suspicion. "Alara," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "What do you have behind your back?" "Nothing," she said, sweat trickling down her spine. "New recipe. Very experimental. Needs darkness." "In a willow basket?" He had seen it. Of course he had. The man missed nothing. "It's traditional," she insisted, channeling every ounce of charm she possessed. "Rustic, artisanal." Silas moved. He was faster than a man in a three-piece suit had any right to be. He sidestepped her attempts to block him, reaching out to grasp the handle of the basket. "Silas, no!" Alara cried out, grabbing his wrist. The contact sent a shockwave through both of them, hot and jarring. For a second, he froze, staring at her hand on his skin. But his sense of duty was stronger than the spark. "I am a sworn officer of the city, Alara. You have unauthorized biological matter in a bakery. Show me. Now." He tugged the basket from her grip. Time seemed to slow down. Alara held her breath, waiting for the scream, the confusion, the inevitable phone call to the authorities. She watched Silas look down into the dark silk folds. He stared. The baby stared back, violet eyes wide and unblinking. The child raised a tiny fist and waved it in the air. A small, impossible puff of purple smoke burped from the baby's lips, smelling of lilacs and ozone. Silas blinked. He looked at the baby. He looked at the smoke dissipating in the air. Then he looked up at Alara, his slate-gray eyes wide with a mixture of horror and a sudden, fracturing crack in his reality. "Alara," he whispered, the clipboard slipping from his numb fingers to clatter loudly on the floor. "Why is this baby smoking?" Dear listeners, please leave a comment about which city you are listening from and subscribe to the channel. In the name of love. This will support me and give me inspiration for new stories. "Smoking?" Alara Vance repeated the word, her voice rising an octave higher than she would have liked. She clutched the bundle of silk and mystery tighter to her chest, shielding the infant's violet eyes from the health inspector's piercing gaze. "Don't be absurd, Mr. Thorne. Babies don't smoke. That's talcum powder. A very aggressive brand of organic talcum powder." Silas Thorne did not look convinced. He stood amidst the warm, chaotic charm of the moonlit crumb, looking like a sleek, charcoal-gray dagger that had been dropped into a basket of yarn. He adjusted his wire-rimmed spectacles, the movement precise and practiced, though Alara noticed a slight tremor in his hand, the only evidence that his rigid worldview had just taken a direct hit. "Talcum powder does not smell of ozone and thunderstorms, Ms. Vance," Silas said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that vibrated uncomfortably in Alara's chest. "And it certainly doesn't defy gravity in purple rings." "It's artisanal," she lied smoothly, turning her hip to block his view as the baby hiccuped again. Another puff of violet mist drifted up over her shoulder. Alara waved her hand frantically, dispersing it into the scent of cinnamon rolls. "We're experimenting with atmospheric sensory experiences for the customers. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to put my nephew down for a nap." Without waiting for his permission, Alara marched toward the back room, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Her magic, usually a simmering pot of intuition and intent, was currently boiling over, aggravated by the hot flash creeping up her neck and the sheer panic of harboring a magical fugitive. The air around her crackled. The fairy lights strung along the ceiling flickered in time with her pulse. She deposited the baby into a wicker laundry basket lined with clean aprons, whispering a hasty sleeping charm. "Slumber deep, silence keep." eyes of violet, go to sleep. The baby yawned, the purple light in its eyes dimming as lashes fluttered shut. Alara exhaled, leaning against the doorframe for a mere second. She caught her reflection in the prep table's stainless steel surface. Her auburn curls were wild, escaping the clip she'd shoved them into, and the silver streak at her temple seemed to be vibrating with static. She looked like a woman on the edge of a breakdown or a breakthrough. At 46, the line between the two was often perilously thin. "Ms. Vance," Silas's voice came from the main floor, cool and demanding. "The inspection isn't finished. I need to see the dry storage now." Alara groaned, pushing off the doorframe. She smoothed her apron over her hips, trying to summon the composure of a business owner and not a witch hiding a smoking baby. "Coming, Mr. Thorne, though I assure you, the only thing dry in there is your sense of humor." She swept back into the kitchen, finding Silas waiting by the pantry door. He held his clipboard like a shield, his jawline sharp enough to cut the tension in the room. Up close, the silver in his hair caught the afternoon light filtering through the rain-streaked windows, giving him a halo of iron and authority. "After you," he said, his slate-gray eyes tracking her movement. Alara unlocked the heavy oak door of the pantry. This was dangerous territory. While the front of the shop was all sugar and flour, the pantry was where the real work happened. It smelled of earth, dried sage, and the dark, loamy scent of roots pulled from the ground by moonlight. Silas stepped inside, his polished Oxfords clicking on the stone floor. He immediately began scrutinizing the shelves. He ran a finger along a jar labeled sun-dried tomatoes, which actually contained dehydrated toadstools for a vitality brew. "Dust," he noted, marking his paper. "Flavor crystals," she corrected, crossing her arms. He ignored her, moving deeper into the narrow space. The shelves towered above them, packed with jars of every shape and size. Alara felt a prickle of unease. Her magic was surging again, a tidal wave of heat that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was the menopause, the great rewiring, making her power spike and sputter like a faulty circuit. Silas stopped abruptly. He reached out, his long manicured fingers closing around a mesh bag hanging from a hook. Inside, several gnarled, shriveled roots twisted around each other, looking disturbingly like tiny, agonizing human figures. "Good God," Silas breathed, recoiling slightly, but holding his ground. He held the bag up to the dim light. "What is this? Dead rodents? This is a biohazard, Ms. Vance. I'll have to shut you down immediately." "Give me that!" Alara surged forward. "It's mandrake root, you Philistine! It's for teas, digestion. It is not a rat." "It looks like a mummified finger," Silas snapped, turning to face her. The space was too small for their antagonism. He was tall, looming over her, smelling of rain, expensive starch, and a hint of sandalwood soap. It was a clean, masculine scent that cut through the heavy, herbal atmosphere of the pantry. Alara reached for the bag, her hand colliding with his. Skin met skin. The reaction was instantaneous. It wasn't the static shock of a carpet in winter. It was a thud, a heavy, resonant vibration that traveled up Alara's arm and slammed into her chest. The erratic, jagged spikes of her menopausal magic didn't flare up. Instead, they slammed into a wall of solid, unyielding earth. Silas gasped, his eyes widening behind his spectacles. He didn't pull away. For a heartbeat, they stood frozen, his large, cool hand trapping hers against the mesh bag of roots. The buzzing in Alara's ears stopped. The hot flash that had been threatening to boil her blood evaporated, replaced by a cool, steady hum. It was as if he were a grounding rod, absorbing her excess voltage and funneling it harmlessly away. Silas blinked, looking down at their joined hands. The slate gray of his eyes darkened, the pupils dilating. "I caught a spark," he murmured, his voice rougher than before. "Static," Alara whispered, though she knew it wasn't. Her breath hitched. She should pull away, she should kick him out, but the relief of his touch was intoxicating. For the first time in weeks, she didn't feel like she was vibrating out of her own skin. Silas slowly withdrew his hand, though he didn't step back. The air between them was thick, heavy with unspoken questions and a sudden, terrifying awareness of the other's physicality. He cleared his throat, adjusting his tie, looking everywhere but at her eyes. "Mandrake," he said, his voice strained as he tried to retreat into bureaucracy. "Is it FDA approved?" "It's ancient," Alara replied, her voice husky. She rubbed her hand where he had touched her, the skin still tingling with a phantom weight. "Silas, why are you so intent on finding something wrong here?" You've checked the fridge temperature 3 times. You've inspected the floorboards for rot that isn't there. Why do you hate my bakery? Silas stiffened, his shoulders squaring inside that immaculate suit. He turned away, pretending to inspect a jar of pickled peppers. The silence stretched, filled only by the sound of rain drumming against the roof. I don't hate your bakery, Alara, he said quietly, using her first name for the second time that day. It sounded intimate, illicit on his tongue. I hate chaos. A little flour on the floor isn't chaos. Starts with flour, Silas said, turning back to her. His face was unguarded for the first time, the lines around his mouth deepening. It starts with a little dust, a little oversight. And then it becomes grease fires. It becomes vermin. It becomes sickness. He took a step closer, his expression intense. My mother, she was a hoarder. Not the TV kind, the dangerous kind. By the time I was 12, I couldn't walk through our kitchen without stepping on trash. We had rats nesting in the stove. I got salmonella twice before I was 15 because she couldn't tell the difference between aged and rotten. Alara softened, her heart giving a painful tug. She looked at this man, this silver-armored knight of checklists and regulations, and suddenly saw the scared boy beneath the suit. He wasn't trying to destroy her. He was trying to keep the world from collapsing into the filth of his childhood. Silas, she said softly, stepping closer. The scent of lavender and scorched butter clinging to her apron seemed to wrap around him. My kitchen isn't your mother's kitchen, and I'm not chaos, I'm just, complicated. He looked down at her, his gaze dropping to her lips before snapping back to her eyes. The hunger in his expression wasn't about food. It was the look of a man who had starved himself of softness for decades in favor of cold, hard structure. You are entirely chaos, Alara, he whispered, and it sounded like a confession. You defy logic. You have smoking babies and roots that look like men and eyes that change color when you're angry. You are everything I should avoid. Then why are you still standing in my pantry? She challenged, her voice low. The energy in the room shifted again. The magic inside her, sensing his proximity, reached out. A jar of honey on the shelf above them rattled. The lid of a tin of cinnamon unscrewed itself with a soft metallic sigh. Silas didn't notice the jar. He was too busy looking at the pulse fluttering in Alara's throat. Because, he said, leaning in, his hand lifting as if to cup her face, I can't seem to... Crash! The sound of shattering glass from the front of the shop tore through the moment like a scream. Silas flinched, his reflex to protect kicking in instantly. He spun around, placing himself between Alara and the door. Stay here, he ordered, the authority snapping back into place like a visor slamming shut. No, Alara said, dread pooling in her stomach. That wasn't a clumsy customer. She could feel the vibration in the floorboards. The wards she had placed on the front door had been breached. She pushed past him, rushing out of the pantry and into the main bakery. The scene was impossible. The front window, the large, beautiful pane of glass painted with gold leaf, was intact. But the display case was shattered. Glass covered the floor like diamonds. And hovering in the center of the room, suspended 3 feet in the air, was the wicker laundry basket. The baby was awake. The infant was wailing, a high, piercing sound that didn't just hurt the ears, it rattled the teeth. But it wasn't just crying. With every scream, a shockwave of purple energy rippled outward, knocking chairs over and sending napkins swirling into a vortex. Silas skidded to a halt beside Alara. He stared at the levitating basket. He stared at the purple shockwaves. He stared at the destruction. He took off his glasses slowly, cleaning them on his silk tie, and then put them back on. The scene did not change. Alara, Silas said, his voice dangerously calm, a steel beam bending under impossible weight. I'm going to ask you one more time. And if you tell me that is a humidifier, I am going to lose my mind. Alara opened her mouth to speak, to invent another lie, but the baby let out another shriek. The lights in the bakery blew out, plunging them into shadow. The only illumination came from the eerie, violet glow emanating from the child. The baby turned its head. It looked straight at Silas. The crying stopped instantly. The child cooed, reached out a chubby hand, and a spark of purple lightning arced across the room, striking Silas squarely in the chest. He didn't fall. He didn't burn. Instead, he absorbed it. The purple light flared around him, outlining his suit, his stunned face, and his wide eyes in a crackling aura of power that was decidedly not human. Silas looked down at his own glowing hands, then up at Alara. The skepticism was gone. replaced by a terrifying, dawning comprehension. "What?" he demanded, the word echoing in the sudden silence. "Did you just do to me?" The silence that followed was heavy, tasting of ozone and scorched sugar. For a heartbeat, the purple afterimage of the child's outburst burned against Alara's retinas, framing Silas Thorne not as a bureaucrat, but as something statuesque and immovable. He stood amidst the fading crackle of energy, his charcoal suit unruffled, his chest rising and falling in a rhythm that was irritatingly calm. Then, the bakery lights flickered and buzzed back to life. The hum of the refrigerator kicked in, grounding the room in the mundane reality of compressors and coolants. Silas blinked, the supernatural violet hue vanished from his skin, leaving him looking merely human again, albeit a human who had just weathered a storm without an umbrella. He reached up, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles with a hand that did not shake. It was a gesture of supreme, infuriating control. "Static!" Alara blurted out, the lie tasting like ash on her tongue. She clutched the baby tighter to her chest. The child, apparently exhausted by its display of pyrotechnics, was now gumming her collar with innocent contentment. "Dry air. Old carpets. It's a conduction issue." Silas stared at her. His eyes, the color of wet slate, narrowed slightly. He looked down at his chest, brushing a speck of invisible dust from his lapel where the lightning had struck. "Static," he repeated. His voice was a low, resonant baritone that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. "Ms. Vance, static electricity does not possess a visible color spectrum, nor does it typically carry the force of a taser." "You'd be surprised what faulty wiring can do in a building from 1920, Alara countered, her heart hammering against her ribs. A hot flash, sudden and violent, surged up her neck. It wasn't just the menopause, it was the magic, roiling beneath her skin, reacting to his skepticism like oil to water. She felt a phantom wind whipping around her ankles, smelling of crushed sage and panic. Silas took a step forward. The scent of him hit her, crisp linen, rain-drenched pavement, and the deep, masculine musk of sandalwood. It was a clean, orderly smell, a stark contrast to the yeasty, chaotic warmth of her bakery. "I am not here to discuss the laws of physics, however much you seem intent on violating them," Silas said, his gaze dropping to the baby. His expression shifted. The razor-sharp lines of his jaw softened, just a fraction, by a tension that looked suspiciously like concern. "I am here because I saw the way you looked at that child. And more importantly, I know what happens when the state intervenes in cases of abandoned minors." Alara stiffened. "I didn't abandon anyone. She was left here. I'm protecting her." "I know." Silas reached into the inner pocket of his jacket. Alara flinched, half expecting a crucifix or a citation pad, but he withdrew a sleek, leather-bound notebook and a heavy fountain pen. He moved to the nearest table, one she hadn't had time to wipe down, and cleared a space with his elbow. "Which is why we need to discuss the inspection protocol immediately." Alara blinked, her magical defenses faltering in the face of his administrative pivot. "The what?" "The protocol," Silas said, uncapping the pen. The nib glinted under the kitchen lights. "If you intend to keep this child out of the emergency foster system for the next 48 hours, you need a legal shield. You are a single woman running a food establishment with several pending health code citations. You are prime meat for the social services wolves." He looked up, his gaze piercing her. "I have a law degree, Ms. Vance. Before I dedicated my life to public health and safety, I practiced family law. I know the loopholes. I can file a provisional kinship affidavit stating you are a distant relative, giving us time to locate the actual parents or establish a proper guardian. But I cannot do that if this place is a hazard." Alara felt the air leave her lungs. She shifted the baby to her other hip. The child let out a soft, sleepy burp that smelled of milk and ozone. You want to help me keep her?" "I want to ensure the infant survives," Silas corrected, his tone clipped. "The foster system in this county is overcrowded and underfunded. A child with unique temperaments would not fare well." He glanced meaningfully at the light fixture that had just blown out. "However, I will not attach my name to an establishment that breeds salmonella. If I am to vouch for you, I must be assured of the environment's safety. Personally," Alara narrowed her eyes. The heat in her blood was settling into a slow, simmering burn. "Personally? I will require full access," Silas said, writing something in his notebook with precise, angular strokes. "Daily inspections, morning and evening. I need to verify that your electrical issues are resolved." and that the hygiene standards are impeccable while the child is on the premises. Absolutely not, Alara snapped. The very idea of this man, this walking embodiment of rulers and thermometers, prowling through her kitchen while she was trying to brew protection potions or bake intention into her sourdough was laughable. I have a business to run. I can't have you hovering over my shoulder while I'm working. My process is sensitive. Sensitive, Silas echoed dryly. He leaned back against the table, crossing his arms. The fabric of his suit strained delightfully across his shoulders, a detail Alara tried very hard to ignore. Ms. Vance, you just generated a localized thunderstorm in a commercial kitchen. Sensitive implies a level of delicacy I have yet to witness. It's an artisanal process, Alara argued, her voice rising. The pots hanging from the ceiling rack began to sway gently, chiming against each other without a breeze. Silas glanced at them, then back at her, his eyebrow arching behind his glasses. Look, she said, forcing her magic to settle, imagining it as a heavy stone dropping into a well. I appreciate the legal help, truly, I do. But there are times of the day when I cannot be disturbed, the fermentation stages. The yeast is temperamental. It requires absolute stillness and privacy. Silas studied her. He was a man who read regulations for fun, but he was also a man who observed human behavior. He knew she was hiding something. She could see the calculation in his slate-gray eyes, weighing the risk of the unknown against the immediate danger to the child. A compromise, then, Silas said slowly. He pushed off the table and walked toward her. He stopped just inside the boundary of her personal space. The heat radiating from him was not magical, but entirely, distractingly biological. I will handle the legal filings. I will keep the wolves from your door for 1 week. In exchange, I conduct my inspections, but... He raised a finger. Alara held her breath. The scent of scorched butter and lavender swirled around them. I will agree to a restricted zone during your so-called fermentation hours, he conceded. I will not enter the back preparation room between the hours of midnight and 3 a.m., Alara said quickly. The witching hour. The time when her moonlight infusions were most potent and her control was most slippery. Silas checked his watch, a sleek, silver analog piece that probably cost more than her oven. Very well. From midnight to 3, the back room is yours. The rest of the bakery and the safety of that child is my jurisdiction. Do we have an accord? He extended his hand. It was a large hand, the fingers long and square-tipped, the palm calloused not from labor, but from life. It was a hand of authority. Alara hesitated. Taking the hand of a skeptic while holding a magical child was risky. Her own magic was fraying at the edges, reacting to the stress and the hormonal tides crashing through her body. But she looked down at the baby's sleeping face. She needed him. She needed his rigid, slate-gray world to build a fence around her wild, colorful chaos. Deal, Alara whispered. She reached out and grasped his hand. The contact was shocking. It wasn't a spark this time. It was a thud, a deep, resonant impact that felt like a heavy door slamming shut, locking them together. His skin was cool and dry, contrasting with her own feverish warmth. But beneath the cool exterior, Alara felt something else. A steadfastness, a density of spirit that was so incredibly heavy it anchored her floating, frantic magic. Silas didn't pull away. He frowned, looking down at their joined hands. His thumb brushed purely by accident against the sensitive skin of her inner wrist, right over her pulse point. A shiver ripped through Alara, hot and sweet. The pots above them stopped chiming instantly. The air in the room went still, sucked into the vacuum of their touch. You have a fever, Silas murmured, his voice dropping to a rough whisper. He didn't let go. If anything, his grip tightened, encompassing her hand completely. Your skin is burning, Alara. It was the first time he had used her first name. It sounded like a spell coming from his lips. I'm fine, she breathed, though the room was beginning to spin. The grounding force of him was overwhelming. It was pulling too much from her, or perhaps pushing too much reality into her veins. Just the oven, it runs hot. Silas looked up, locking eyes with her. Behind the wire-rimmed glasses, the skepticism was warring with a primal, undeniable attraction. He stepped closer, invading her space, his authority dissolving into something far more dangerous. The oven is off, Alara, he said softly. Before she could answer, the baby in her arms stirred. The child's eyes snapped open, not the milky blue of an infant, but a swirling, deep violet. The baby looked at their joined hands, then up at Silas, and smiled. A sensation like a hook snagged behind Alara's navel. She tried to pull her hand back, but she couldn't. It wasn't that Silas was holding her. It was that the air around their fingers had solidified. A band of cold silver light began to manifest around Silas's wrist, winding up his forearm like a shackle, glowing with the same eerie light the baby had emitted. Silas stared at his own arm, his face draining of color. "Ms. Vance," he said, his voice straining for calm but hitting a jagged edge of panic. "Why can I not let go?" "I don't know," Alara gasped, tugging fruitlessly. The magic wasn't hers. It was the baby's. It was binding them. "Silas, stop pulling. You'll make it tighter." "Make what tighter?" he demanded. He yanked his hand back with all his strength. There was a sound like a cracking whip. The invisible force didn't break. It snapped them together. Alara was hauled forward, stumbling against his chest. The baby was sandwiched safely between them, cooing happily. Silas's arms instinctively went around her to steady them both, his hands splaying across her back. The heat of him seared through her shirt. For a moment, they were pressed intimately, scandalously close, his breath hitching in her ear. Then he looked down. The silver light on his wrist hadn't faded. It had etched itself into his skin, forming a perfect, shimmering loop of runic script that pulsed in time with Alara's heart. Silas looked at the mark, then at Alara, his eyes wide with a horror that no amount of logic could explain away. "Tell me," he whispered, his voice trembling with a rage that masked a profound terror, "that you did not just brand me." "Branded?" Alara echoed, her voice pitching up an octave. She snatched his wrist, her thumb brushing over the pulsing silver script. His skin was fever hot, a stark contrast to the icy draft suddenly sweeping through the bakery. "Silas, don't be dramatic. It's an allergic reaction to the flour or the yeast." Silas Thorne stared at her, his slate-gray eyes narrowing behind the wire-rimmed spectacles. He looked like a man watching the laws of physics crumble and deciding to sue them for breach of contract. "An allergic reaction that spells out ancient syntax and coherent loops? Do you take me for a fool, Ms. Vance? I have a master's degree in public health and another in structural engineering. I know what a rash looks like. This is not a rash. This is neon graffiti on my person." He tried to pull his hand away again. The silver light flared, tightening the invisible tether between them. He stopped, exhaling a sharp, frustrated breath through his nose, a muscle jumping in his jaw. "It's fading," Alara lied, though the mark was actually glowing brighter, a soft bioluminescence that cast eerie shadows against the bakery's subway-tiled walls. "Look, just breathe. My magic, my energy is a little sensitive right now. It reacts to stress. And you, Mr. Thorne, are a walking stress fracture." Before Silas could retort with a citation regarding health code violations pertaining to unauthorized body modification, the bakery door slammed open. It wasn't the wind. It was a physical assault of air, snow, and fury. The bell above the door didn't just jingle. It screamed, torn from its bracket and flung across the room. A wall of white obliterated the view of the cobbled street outside. The temperature in the cozy shop plummeted 20 degrees in a heartbeat, freezing the condensation on the display cases into intricate, fern-like patterns of frost. "Close it!" Silas roared over the gale, his skepticism momentarily overridden by the primal need for shelter. He lunged for the door, dragging Alara with him due to the magical tether. Together, they slammed their weight against the oak and glass. The wind pushed back with the strength of a living thing, a heavy, wet pressure that smelled of ozone and ancient ice. With a grunt of exertion that strained the seams of his charcoal suit, Silas managed to engage the deadbolt. He leaned his forehead against the wood, breathing hard. "Explain," he said, not turning around. "The forecast called for light flurries. This is a nor'easter." Alara looked toward the counter where the wicker basket sat. The baby was awake now, her eyes, too old, too knowing, fixed on the swirling white void outside the window. The child waved a chubby fist, and outside, a street lamp exploded in a shower of sparks. The bakery plunged into darkness. "Power grid failure due to ice load," Silas announced into the blackness, his voice tight. "Logical consequence of the weather." Alara didn't have the heart or the courage to tell him that the storm was currently throwing a tantrum because the baby wanted a bottle. She fumbled in her apron pocket for a box of matches. "I have candles. Stay where you are. I don't want you tripping over the displays." A match flared, smelling of sulfur and comfort. Alara moved through the shop, lighting the fat beeswax pillars she kept on the tables. Slowly, the bakery transformed. The sterile darkness retreated, replaced by a golden, flickering intimacy. The shadows stretched long and dancing, softening the sharp lines of Silas's face as he turned to look at her. He stood by the door, dusting snow from his shoulders with precise, angry movements. Even in a crisis, the man was immaculate, but the candlelight caught something else. The rigid set of his shoulders, the white-knuckled grip on his own wrist where the mark burned. "We're trapped," he said, walking to the window and peering out. Snow is already drifting 3 feet high against the glass. The roads will be impassable. "The ovens act as a thermal mass," Alara said, trying to keep her voice steady. Her internal temperature was spiking, a hot flash that felt less like biology and more like a solar flare. She unbuttoned the top of her cardigan. "It'll stay warm in here for hours." "And the child?" Silas asked, his gaze shifting to the basket. "She's fine. She likes the cold." As if to prove the point, the baby let out a sneeze. It was a tiny, adorable sound. Ah-choo. Crack. The large front window pane, a sheet of glass that had survived 3 decades of storms, shattered. It didn't fall inward. It simply spiderwebbed, with a sound like a gunshot, the cracks radiating outward from a center point that aligned perfectly with the baby's line of sight. Wind howled through the fissures. Silas flinched, shielding his face, then stared at the glass. "Thermal shock," he muttered, his voice sounding thinner. Rapid pressure drop combined with the temperature differential between the interior and exterior. The glazing was likely compromised by age. Alara stared at him. The man was clinging to physics like a drowning sailor to a piece of driftwood. It was almost endearing. "Right. Thermal shock. Silas, we need to move away from the front. It's going to get freezing in here." She grabbed the basket. The tether on their wrists jerked Silas forward. He looked at the glowing handcuff, then at the broken window, and finally at Alara. He didn't argue. He simply adjusted his glasses, buttoned his suit jacket, and followed her to the back of the bakery. The heart of the moonlit crumb was the massive stone hearth oven. Even with the gas lines cut, the stones held the memory of the day's fire. The air here smelled of toasted oats, scorched butter, and dried sage. Alara pulled a pile of heavy flour sacks and a couple of thick wool blankets from her office onto the floor in front of the iron door. "Sit," she commanded, dropping to the makeshift nest. Her knees popped. God, my joints hate this weather. Silas hesitated, looking at the flour sacks with the expression of a man asked to sit in a puddle of sludge. But the cold was already creeping in, a biting draft that cut through his expensive wool suit. With a resigned sigh, he lowered himself onto the blanket, maintaining a stiff, dignified posture. They sat in the semi-darkness, the only light coming from the candles Alara had moved to the prep table and the dying red glow from the oven vents. "You're shivering," Alara noted softly. "I am acclimatized to climate-controlled offices," Silas said through gritted teeth. "Not Arctic survival situations in a bakery." "Come closer." "Ms. Vance, I hardly think—" "Silas, for the love of Goddess, I am 46 years old, tired, and currently suffering from a hot flash that could melt lead. You are freezing. I am a radiator. Put your puritanical code of ethics aside and share the heat." He looked at her, the candlelight reflecting in the slate of his eyes. Slowly, he shifted. He moved within the circle of her warmth. They weren't touching, not quite, but she could feel the radiant chill coming off him, and he, undoubtedly, could feel the furnace of her skin. The silence stretched, filled only by the howling wind outside and the rhythmic, contended gurgling of the baby in the basket between them. "Why do you do it?" Alara asked quietly. The suits, the clipboard, the need to control everything. Silas looked at his hands. He rubbed the silver mark on his wrist, which had dimmed to a soft pulse. "Chaos is dangerous, Alara. The world is messy. People get hurt when things aren't regulated, when standards aren't met. I create order. It's how I keep people safe." He looked up, and for the first time, the skepticism was gone, replaced by a raw, naked honesty. "I don't understand your world. I don't understand how glass breaks from a sneeze, or how a blizzard appears in seconds, or how you—" He trailed off, his gaze dropping to her mouth. "How I what?" she whispered. "How you make me feel like I'm standing on the edge of a cliff," he murmured, "and that falling might be the only logical option." The air between them changed. It grew thick, heavy with the scent of lavender and the musk of his cologne. sandalwood, and expensive scotch. The magic in Alara's blood surged, responding to the proximity to the man. It wasn't the volatile crone fire of her menopause this time. It was something ancient, liquid, and sweet. Silas leaned in. It was a microscopic movement, a surrender of inches. His eyes searched hers, terrifyingly intense. He raised a hand, his fingers hesitating before brushing a curl of auburn hair away from her cheek. His touch was electric, shocking against her flushed skin. Alara, he breathed. The name sounded like a prayer from the mouth of an atheist. She found herself leaning toward him, drawn by a gravity she couldn't control. She wanted to taste the rigidity of him, to see if he tasted like rain and ink. Her lips parted. He tilted his head, his lashes lowering, the sharp line of his jaw softening. Zap! A spark of static magic leaped from her skin to his cheek. It wasn't painful, but it was startling. A visible arc of blue light. Alara jerked back, slamming her back against the warm stones of the oven. Panic, cold and sharp, doused the heat in her veins. "I can't," she gasped, pulling her knees to her chest. "Silas, stop!" Silas froze, his hands suspended in midair. He blinked, the haze of desire clearing instantly, replaced by his default mask of polite distance. He cleared his throat and adjusted his tie, though it was perfectly straight. "I apologize. That was unprofessional. The stress of the situation." "It's not that," Alara said, her voice trembling. She looked at her hands. Sparks were dancing between her fingertips, little biting gnats of power. "Look at me, Silas. I'm unstable. My magic is changing. I don't know what it does anymore. If I kiss you, I might burn you. I might turn you into a newt. I can't control it." "Alara?" "You want order," she said, her eyes pleading with him to understand. "You want safety. I am the opposite of that right now. I am a walking natural disaster." Silas looked at her, really looked at her. He didn't look afraid of the sparks. He looked determined. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to offer a counter-argument based on risk assessment, but the sound of the wind suddenly ceased. Total silence. The heavy oak door, which they had bolted and barred, didn't burst open this time. Instead, a heavy, rhythmic thudding began against the wood. Thump, thump, thump. It wasn't the wind. The baby in the basket began to wail, a high, piercing sound of absolute terror. Silas scrambled to his feet, placing himself between Alara and the front of the shop. He reached into his jacket, not for a weapon, but for a heavy iron flashlight. "Stay back," he ordered, his voice dropping to a growl. From beneath the gap in the door, a shadow began to seep into the room. It wasn't a shadow cast by light, it was a physical substance, an inky sludge moving against the floorboards, ignoring gravity, ignoring physics. The shadow coalesced, rising up, forming the silhouette of a woman with limbs that were too long and fingers that ended in points sharp enough to slice glass. Silas stepped back, his back bumping into Alara's chest. He didn't ask about thermal shock. He didn't cite a code. "Alara," he said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "Please tell me you have a recipe for this." The air in the kitchen of the moonlit crumb smelled of scorched milk and ozone, a scent that sat heavy on the tongue like a copper coin. It was 3 a.m, and the storm outside had nothing on the tempest brewing inside Alara Vance. "Shh, little one. Please, just breathe." Alara rocked the basket, her arms aching, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The baby, a foundling who had appeared on her doorstep only days ago, was burning up. It wasn't a normal fever. Heat radiated from the infant's skin in waves that rippled the air, distorting the view of the industrial mixers lining the back wall. But it wasn't just the child. It was Alara. A hot flash, sudden and violent, surged through her. It started at the base of her spine and roared upward, a wildfire of hormonal alchemy that her magic, unstable, unpredictable, and utterly rude these past few months, decided to amplify. Clang. Alara flinched. Above the center island, a heavy copper saucepan lifted itself off the hook. It hovered, rotating slowly, defying gravity with a drunken, menacing wobble. "Stop it!" she hissed, her voice cracking. She wasn't sure if she was speaking to the cookware or her own treacherous body. "Not now! I can't do this now!" The baby let out a high, keening wail that shattered the last of Alara's composure. The sound was a jagged hook in her chest. The kitchen responded. The cupboard doors rattled in their frames. A jar of dried sage exploded on the shelf, showering the floor in green dust. The temperature in the room spiked 10 degrees in a heartbeat. Alara clutched the edge of the prep table, her knuckles white, sweat beading at her hairline, plastering a rogue curl of silver-streaked auburn hair to her temple. She was losing it. The barrier she kept between her emotions and her power was dissolving, melted by exhaustion and the terrifying heat radiating from the child. The bell above the shop entrance jingled. Not a magical warning, just the simple brass mechanics of the front door opening. Alara spun around, placing her body between the floating saucepan and the hallway leading to the front. She expected the shadow creature to be back, the ink blot monster that had terrorized them hours ago. She raised a hand, fingers trembling, ready to throw a blast of raw kinetic energy that would likely take out the wall along with the intruder. "Alara?" The voice was deep, resonant, and irritatingly calm. Silas Thorne. He stepped into the kitchen, shedding his wet trench coat with the practiced efficiency of a man who compartmentalized everything. He was still wearing that charcoal suit, though the tie was loosened, a concession to the late hour that somehow made him look more dangerous, not less. The harsh fluorescent lights glinted off his wire-rimmed spectacles. He looked up. He froze. The copper saucepan was still floating. A wooden spoon had joined it, orbiting the pan like a bewildered satellite. Silas didn't scream. He didn't run. His jaw, that sharp, magnificent jaw that she had fantasized about slapping or kissing in equal measure, tightened until a muscle feathered in his cheek. His slate-gray eyes tracked the floating spoon, then snapped to Alara. "That is a code violation," he said, his voice flat. "Unsecured overhead hazards." "Silas, get out!" Alara choked out, turning back to the baby as the infant's wail turned into a ragged cough. I can't stop it." "The fever." He stepped closer, ignoring the spoon that dipped aggressively toward his head. "Everything!" Alara cried. Tears, hot and humiliating, pricked her eyes. "The heat, the noise, the gravity. It's all boiling over and I can't put the lid back on." Another jar popped, cinnamon this time. The red powder drifted down like apocalyptic snow. The floorboards groaned, vibrating under Alara's feet. Silas closed the distance between them in 3 long strides. He didn't look at the chaos swirling around the room. He looked only at her. He bypassed the impossible physics and zeroed in on the human panic. "Give her to me," he ordered. "What? No, you don't understand. It's unsafe." "Alara, give me the child." It wasn't a request. It was the voice of a man who inspected foundations for cracks and ensured structures did not collapse. Trembling, she passed the bundle into his arms. Silas took the baby, cradling her against the fine wool of his suit without a moment's hesitation. He placed a large, cool hand against the baby's forehead, then moved to the far side of the room, placing the basket gently on the stainless steel counter, away from the hovering cookware. "She's burning, but her breathing is steady," Silas said, his back to Alara. "She's fighting it. She's strong." "I'm not," Alara whispered. The admission felt like a surrender. The room spun. A heavy cast-iron skillet began to rattle on the stove, clattering louder and louder. Silas turned back to her. He walked right through the cloud of cinnamon dust. He stopped inches from her, invading her space, his presence a wall of cool, hard reality against her feverish storm. "Look at me," he commanded. Alara shook her head, her eyes squeezed shut. "I can't. If I let go, I'll blow the windows out." 2 warm hands grasped her shoulders. They were firm, unyielding. The shock of his touch was electric, not magical, but purely, devastatingly physical. It grounded her instantly, a lightning rod channeling the excess energy into the earth. "Open your eyes, Lara," she gasped, her eyes flying open. His face was close, too close. She could see the flecks of lighter steel in his gray eyes, the fine lines of exhaustion fanning out from the corners. He smelled of rain, starch, and a hint of expensive scotch. "I don't know what is happening in this kitchen," Silas said, his voice dropping to a rough timbre that vibrated in her chest. "I don't have a form for it. I don't have a regulation for it. But I know you." "You don't," she breathed, her heart stuttering. "I do. You are Alara Vance. You bake bread that makes grown men weep. You have fought me on every citation for 3 years with a stubbornness that borders on art. You are not a woman who breaks." "I'm breaking now, Silas." "Then break against me." The words hung in the air, heavier than the magic. The hovering saucepan clattered to the floor. The wooden spoon dropped. The silence that followed was deafening. Alara stared at him, her chest heaving. The heat inside her hadn't dissipated. But it had changed. It was no longer the chaotic fire of menopause and wild magic. It had sharpened, focused, narrowing down to the man standing before her. She saw the way his gaze dropped to her mouth, then snapped back up to her eyes, a war waging behind his spectacles. The skepticism was gone, replaced by a raw, terrifying hunger. "Silas," she whispered. He didn't wait. One hand slid up her neck, his thumb resting against her pulse point, feeling the wild gallop of her heart. He tilted her head back and crushed his mouth to hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was desperate. It was the collision of two forces that had been circling each other for years. Alara made a noise in the back of her throat, a sound of pure need, and grabbed the lapels of his suit, yanking him closer. His tongue swept into her mouth, tasting of scotch and authority. Alara met him stroke for stroke, her magic flaring not outward, but inward, heating her skin, making her nerves sing. Silas groaned, a low rumble against her lips. He walked her backward until her hips bumped against the prep table. He lifted her easily, setting her on the edge, stepping between her legs as if he belonged there, as if he had always been meant to stand between her and the rest of the world. "You're so hot," he murmured against her jaw, his lips trailing fire down the sensitive column of her neck. "You're burning up." "It's the change," she gasped, her hands tangling in his silver hair, pulling him harder against her. "It's the magic. I don't care what it is." His hands were everywhere, on her waist, her hips, sliding up the soft cotton of her tunic. His touch was possessive, demanding. "God, Alara, do you have any idea how long I've wanted to violate protocol with you?" Alara laughed, a breathless, wet sound. "Shut up about the protocol." She pulled his face back to hers, kissing him with a fervor that swept away the fear, the fatigue, the shadows. For the first time all night, the air in the kitchen was still. The only electricity was the friction of his wool suit against her bare thighs, the scratch of his stubble against her cheek, the solid, unmovable weight of him anchoring her to the here and now. It was messy and unpolished. It was frantic hands fumbling with belts and fabric. It was the glorious, terrifying realization that the skepticism she had found so annoying was actually the perfect counterbalance to her chaos. He was the rock. She was the wave. When the crest finally broke, leaving them breathless and clinging to each other in the dim light of the kitchen, the silence was heavy with things that couldn't be unsaid. Alara rested her forehead against his shoulder, her breathing slowing. Silas stood between her knees, his arms wrapped tight around her, his face buried in the curve of her neck. He was trembling slightly. Slowly, reality began to seep back in. The smell of cinnamon, the baby, miraculously asleep in the basket across the room. Silas pulled back, just enough to look at her. His glasses were crooked, his hair a mess, his lips swollen. He looked devastating. He reached out, straightening his glasses with a shaky hand. He looked around the kitchen, at the spilled spices and the pot on the floor. He cleared his throat. "The pot," he said, his voice raspy. "It was floating, Alara." Alara closed her eyes for a second, summoning her courage. She reached up and gently straightened his collar. "I know." And the table, it was vibrating. "Yes. Physics doesn't work that way." "Not usually," she agreed softly. She looked him in the eye. "I'm a witch, Silas, a kitchen witch. The herbs, the instinctive baking, the luck, it's magic. And lately, with my hormones shifting, it's becoming explosive." Silas stared at her. His brain, a meticulously organized filing cabinet of facts and regulations, was visibly struggling to process the file she had just shoved into it. "A witch," he repeated. "Yes. And the baby. She's special too. That's why she's sick. Her magic is reacting to mine." Silas stepped back, running a hand over his face. He paced a small circle, stepping over the fallen saucepan. "So, the health hazards, the flickering lights last week, the oven that maintains temperature without gas. Me," she said simply. "All me." He stopped pacing. He looked at the baby, then back to Alara. The skepticism was fighting a losing battle against the memory of the floating cookware and the woman he had just held in his arms. "I should write you up," he muttered, but there was no heat in it. He walked back to her, taking her hands in his thumbs brushed over her knuckles. "I can't explain this. I can't rationalize it, but I'm not leaving." Alara's heart swelled. "You're not?" "No, you're a hazard, Alara Vance, but you're my hazard." He leaned in to kiss her again, a soft, promising seal on a new reality. Alara melted, finally feeling safe. Boom! The sound wasn't a knock. It was an explosion. The heavy oak door at the front of the shop didn't just open, it disintegrated. Wood shards and twisted metal hinges shrieked through the air, blasting down the hallway and skidding across the kitchen floor. The temperature in the room plummeted 50 degrees in a second. The smell of ozone vanished, replaced by the stench of rotting swamp water and ancient, frozen earth. Silas spun around, shoving Alara behind him, instinctively reaching for a flashlight that was no longer a sufficient weapon. Alara scrambled off the table, her hands raised, magic surging hot and violent in her veins once more. From the darkness of the shattered storefront, a voice echoed. Not a sound, but a vibration in the teeth. The child. Give us the child. The shadows did not merely enter the kitchen. They bled into it, a dark, viscous tide oozing over the pristine white tile. The entity standing in the shattered doorway was a towering void of smoke and malice, shaped vaguely like a man, but possessing none of humanity's warmth. The air tasted of copper and stagnant pond water, choking out the comforting scent of Alara's lavender detergent. "Silas, get back!" Alara hissed, her voice trembling not with fear, but with a sudden, overwhelming surge of heat. It started in her chest, a familiar, frantic flush that had nothing to do with the monster and everything to do with her changing body. The magic inside her, usually a flowing river, was currently a bursting dam. It felt jagged, hot, and impossible to steer. Silas Thorne did not step back. Instead, the silver-haired health inspector adjusted his wire-rimmed spectacles with a terrifying calmness and stepped forward. He looked at the swirling vortex of darkness as if it were a cockroach infestation in a five-star bistro. "I do not know what jurisdiction you believe you have," Silas said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that vibrated through the floorboards. "But you are trespassing on private property, and you have damaged the structural integrity of a licensed food service establishment." The shadow roared, a sound like grinding stones, and lashed out with a tendril of black smoke. Silas didn't flinch. He simply didn't believe the smoke could hurt him, and for a terrifying second, his sheer, stubborn refusal to acknowledge the supernatural seemed to act as a shield. The smoke dissipated inches from his charcoal suit jacket. "Alara," Silas said over his shoulder, his tone clipped and efficient. "Do whatever it is you do. I will hold the line." "I can't!" Alara cried, backing against the stainless steel prep table. Her hands were glowing a violent, sputtering violet. "It's the change, Silas. My magic is flashing. If I throw a banishment spell right now, I could blow up the entire city block. I have no ground. I have no anchor." From the pantry, a small, terrified whimper echoed. The child. The entity surged forward, the darkness coalescing into claws. "Mine." Silas grabbed a heavy cast-iron skillet from the drying rack. A ridiculous weapon against a demon, yet in his grip, it looked lethal. He swung it with precise, calculated violence, connecting with the shadowy limb. Sparks of cold blue light flew upon impact. He was buying her seconds, but he was mortal. He was just a man in a suit fighting a nightmare. "I need iron!" Alara screamed, her mind racing through her grimoire. "I need something immovable, something cold and grounded to channel the excess heat." Silas turned to her, his slate-gray eyes locking onto hers. There was no fear in them, only a rigid, steely determination. He dropped the skillet and crossed the distance between them in 2 long strides, grabbing her wrists. His hands were cool, rough with calluses hidden beneath his manicured exterior, and shockingly strong. "Use me," he commanded. "Silas, no. The backlash will stop your heart. You're human. You're not a conductor." "I am the inspector, Alara. I am the regulation. I am the wall that stops the chaos." He pulled her hands to his chest, right over the charcoal wool of his lapel, pressing her burning palms against his heart. "I don't believe in ghosts, and I don't believe in demons. I believe in physics. I believe in order, and I believe in you. Grounded in me. I can take it." The entity shrieked, sensing the shift in power, and lunged. The room went pitch black. Alara didn't think. She didn't calculate. She simply let go. She closed her eyes and poured the screaming, chaotic fire of her menopause-ridden magic out of her soul. Instead of exploding outward, the energy found a conduit. It slammed into Silas. He gasped, his body going rigid as a board. For a moment, Alara thought she had killed him. She felt the magic hit his skepticism like lightning striking a lightning rod. But he didn't break. Silas Thorne was a man who had stared down health code violations that would make a lesser man weep. He was made of iron will and absolute stubbornness. He absorbed the chaotic heat, his cool rationality filtering the wild magic, stripping away the volatility and leaving only the pure, raw power. "Exire," Alara whispered, the word vibrating with the force of two souls. Silas didn't speak Latin, but he spoke authority. "Get out." A pulse of blinding silver light exploded from where their bodies met. It smelled of ozone, burnt sugar, and the crisp, clean scent of a winter storm. The light expanded in a shockwave, hitting the encroaching darkness and shattering it like glass. The entity didn't just leave, it was erased. The howl it emitted faded into a pathetic whimper before silence slammed back into the room. The temperature stabilized instantly. The smell of rot vanished, replaced by the scent of scorching wool and lavender. Alara's knees buckled. She would have hit the floor if Silas hadn't caught her. He slid down the cabinet with her, pulling her into his lap. He was breathing hard, his immaculate tie skewed to the left, his glasses sitting crookedly on his nose. "Silas?" she whispered, reaching up to touch his jaw. His skin was warm now, flushed with the aftershocks of power. He blinked, his gray eyes regaining their sharp focus behind the crooked lenses. He looked down at his hands, then at the empty doorway, and finally at her. "That," Silas wheezed, adjusting his glasses with a shaking hand, "was not in the manual?" Alara let out a wet, hysterical laugh, burying her face in his neck. "You were the iron! You grounded me!" Silas wrapped his arms around her, holding her so tightly his knuckles turned white. He looked at the destruction of her shop, the broken door, the cracked tiles, and then he looked toward the pantry where the child was now crying softly. "It seems," Silas murmured, resting his chin on top of her wild auburn curls, "that my worldview requires an update. I cannot regulate what I do not acknowledge." He kissed her temple, the touch lingering and possessive. "We will fix the door. We will secure the child. And then, Ms. Vance, you are going to explain to me exactly how we make sure nothing like that ever threatens my bakery or my witch again." Alara looked up, seeing the way the moonlight caught the silver at his temples. He wasn't afraid. He was planning. He was already managing the crisis. "Your witch?" she teased softly. Silas smoothed a stray curl from her face, his expression softening into something devastatingly tender. "Exclusively." 4 years later, the morning sun poured through the bay window of the moonlit crumb, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Though knowing Alara, those might actually be pixies. The bakery smelled divine, a heavy, rich mixture of rising sourdough, cinnamon, and the dark, roasted aroma of expensive coffee. Silas sat at the corner table, the one reserved permanently for management. He had aged like fine wine. The silver in his hair had claimed total dominion, turning him into a striking figure in his navy blue vest and rolled-up shirt sleeves. He was typing furiously on a laptop, a stack of invoices organized with military precision to his left. "Inventory is down on valerian root and organic flour," he called out without looking up. "And Alara, darling, the supplier for the dragon scale sugar is trying to price gouge us again. I've drafted a strongly worded email regarding market fluctuations and contract law. I expect a capitulation by noon." Alara laughed from behind the counter, where she was frosting a tray of lavender scones. Her hair was pulled back in a loose, messy bun, the silver streaks now weaving through the auburn like purposeful lightning. She looked radiant, her movements sure and steady. The hot flashes had passed years ago, leaving her with a well of deep, seasoned power that hummed contentedly beneath her skin. "You terrify the supernatural community, you know," she said, walking over to place a fresh scone and a black coffee next to his laptop. "The local coven thinks you're some kind of warlock because you successfully audited the goblin market." "Forensic accounting is its own form of sorcery," Silas replied dryly, finally looking up. He took her hand, pressing a kiss to her flour-dusted knuckles. The look in his eyes was still sharp, still hungry, but anchored in a profound peace. A bell chimed at the back door. A 4-year-old girl, with tumbling curls and eyes like crushed sage, tore into the room, holding a drawing. "Daddy! Mama! Look!" The little girl, Sophie, skidded to a halt. The drawing in her hand fluttered, and then, with a giggle, she let go of it, but the paper didn't fall. It floated, drifting lazily through the air until it landed precisely on top of Silas's invoices. Silas didn't blink. He picked up the drawing, a crayon masterpiece of a woman with a witch hat, a man in a suit, and a little girl holding a glowing star. Excellent composition, Sophie, Silas said seriously, though his mouth twitched with a smile. But we agreed. No levitation until after breakfast. It upsets the yeast. Sorry, Daddy, Sophie chirped, climbing onto his lap. He adjusted his hold on her automatically, secure and protective, the ultimate iron anchor for 2 generations of wild, magical women. Alara leaned against the table, watching them. The skepticism was gone, replaced by a different kind of vigilance. Silas Thorne had never learned to cast a spell, but he had learned to nurture the magic that mattered most. He caught Alara staring and raised an eyebrow. Is something burning, Miss Vance? No, Alara smiled, feeling the warmth of the sun and the steady, grounding beat of her own heart. Everything is exactly the right temperature. Silas smirked, checked his watch, and turned the laptop screen toward her. Good, because we have a health inspection in 20 minutes, and if they find 1 speck of pixie dust, I'll never hear the end of it. Alara leaned down, capturing his lips in a kiss that tasted of coffee and promise, lingering until Sophie giggled and covered her eyes. Let them come, Alara whispered against his mouth. We can handle anything.